Tynan Portillo presents, featuring the best horror stories of the 19th century. Welcome to the Poe Show podcast. Narrated by Tynan Portillo. Today's episode, The Ghost's Summons by Ada Buisson, with guest narrator Miles Broadhead.
Wanted, sir, a patient. It was in the early days of my professional career, when patients were scarce and fees scarcer. And though I was in the act of sitting down to my chop and had promised myself a glass of steaming punch afterwards, in honor of the Christmas season, I hurried instantly into my surgery. I entered briskly, but no sooner did I catch sight of the figure standing, leaning against the counter, that I started back with a strange feeling of horror, which for the life of me, I could not comprehend. Never shall I forget the ghastliness of that face. The white horror stamped upon every feature. The agony which seemed to sink the very eyes beneath the contracted brows. It was awful to me to behold. Accustomed as I was to scenes of terror. You seek advice, I began with some hesitation.
No, I am not ill.
You require, then?
Hush,
he interrupted, approaching more nearly and dropping his already low murmur to a mere whisper.
I believe you are not rich. Would you be willing to earn £1,000?
£1,000? His words seemed to burn my very ears. I should be thankful if I could do so honestly, I replied with dignity. What is the service required of me? A peculiar look of intense horror passed over the white face before me, but the blue-black lips answered firmly.
To attend a deathbed.
£1,000 to attend a deathbed? Where am I to go then? Who is it?
Mine.
The voice in which this was said sounded so hollow and distant that involuntarily I shrank back. Yours? What nonsense! You're not a dying man. You are pale, but you appear perfectly healthy.
Hush,
he interrupted.
I know all this. You cannot be more convinced of my physical health than I am myself. Yet I know that before the clock tolls the first hour after midnight, I shall be a dead man.
But... He shuddered slightly, but stretching out his hand commandingly, motioned me to be silent.
I am but too well informed of what I affirm,
he said quietly.
I have received a mysterious summons from the dead. No mortal aid can avail me. I am as doomed as the wretch on whom the judge has passed sentence. I do not come either to seek your advice or to argue with you, but simply to buy your services. I offer you £1,000 to pass the night in my chamber and witness the scene which takes place. The sum may appear to you extravagant, but I have no further need to count the cost of any gratification, and the spectacle you will have to witness is no common sight of horror.
The words, strange as they were spoken calmly enough. But as the last sentence dropped slowly from the livid lips, an expression of such wild horror again passed over the stranger's face that in spite of the immense fee, I hesitated to answer.
Ah, you fear to trust the promise of a dead man. See here and be convinced,
he exclaimed eagerly, and the next instant on the counter between us lay a parchment document, and following the indication of a white muscular hand, I read the words, "And to Mr. Frederick Red of 14 High Street, Alton, I bequeath the sum of £1,000 for certain services rendered to me."
I have had that will drawn up within the last 24 hours, and I signed it an hour ago in the presence of competent witnesses. I am prepared, you see. Now, do you accept my offer or not?
My answer was to walk across the room and take down my hat, and then lock the door of the surgery, communicating with the house. It was a dark, icy cold night, and somehow the courage and determination which the sight of my own name in connection with £1,000 had given me flagged considerably as I found myself hurried along the silent darkness by a man whose deathbed I was about to attend. He sat grimly silent, but as his hand touched mine, in spite of the frost, it felt like burning coal. On we went, tramp, tramp through the snow, on, till even I grew weary, and at length on my appalled ear struck the chimes of a church clock, whilst close at hand I distinguished the snowy hillocks of a churchyard. Heavens! Was this awful scene of which I was to be witness to take place veritably amongst the dead?
11.
Groaned the doomed man.
Gracious God, but 2 hours more and that ghostly messenger will bring the summons. Come, for mercy's sake, let us hasten.
There was but a short road separating us now from a wall which surrounded a large mansion, and along this we hastened until we reached a small door. Passing through this in a few minutes, we were stealthily ascending the private staircase to a splendidly furnished apartment, which left no doubt of the wealth of its owner. All was intensely silent. However, through the house and about this room in particular, there was a stillness that, as I gazed around, struck me almost ghastly. My companion glanced at the clock on the mantel shelf and sank into a large chair by the side of the fire with a shudder.
Only an hour and a half longer,
he muttered.
Great heaven, I thought I had more fortitude. This horror unmans me.
Then in a fiercer tone and clutching my arm, he added,
You mock me. You think me mad, but wait till you see. Wait till you see.
I put my hand on his wrist. There was now a fever in his sunken eyes, which checked the superstitious chill which had been gathering over me, and made me hope that after all my first suspicion was correct, and that my patient was but the victim of some fearful hallucination. Mock you, I answered soothingly. Far from it. I sympathize intensely with you, and would do much to aid you. You require sleep. Lie down and leave me to watch. He groaned, but rose and began throwing off his clothes. In watching my opportunity, I slipped a sleeping powder which I had managed to put in my pocket before leaving the surgery into a tumbler of claret that stood beside him. The more I saw, the more I felt convinced that it was the nervous system of my patient which required my attention, and it was with sincere satisfaction I saw him drink the wine and then stretch himself out on the luxurious bed. Huh, thought I as the clock struck 12, and instead of a groan, the deep breathing of the sleeper sounded through the room. He won't receive any summons tonight, and I may make myself comfortable. Noiselessly, therefore, I replenished the fire, poured myself out a glass of wine, and drawing the curtains so the firelight should not disturb the sleeper, I put myself in a position to follow his example. How long I slept I know not, but suddenly I aroused with a start, and as a ghostly thrill of horror as ever I remember to have felt in my life. Something, what I knew not, seemed near, something nameless, but unutterably awful. I gazed around. The fire emitted a faint blue glow, just sufficient to enable me to see that the room was exactly the same way as when I fell asleep. But that long hand of the clock wanted but 5 minutes of this mysterious hour, which was to be the death moment of the summoned man. Was there anything in it then? Any truth but in the strange story he had told? The silence was intense. I could not even hear a breath from the bed, and I was about to rise and approach when again that awful horror seized me. And at the same moment my eye fell upon the mirror opposite the door, and I saw, great heavens, that awful shape, that ghastly mockery of what had been humanity. Was it really a messenger from the buried? Quite dead? It stood there, invisible death cloaks, but the awful face was ghastly with corruption, and the sunken eyes gleamed forth a green, glassy glare, which seems a veritable blast from the internal fires below. To move or utter a sound in that hideous presence was impossible. And like a statue, I sat, and I saw that horrid shape move slowly towards the bed. What was the awful scene enacted there? I know not. I heard nothing except a low, stifled, agonized groan. And I saw the shadow of that ghastly messenger bending over the bed. Whether it was some dreadful but wordless sentence its breathless lips conveyed as it stood there, I know not. But for an instant, the shadow of a claw-like hand, from which the third finger was missing, appeared extended over the doomed man's head. And then as the clock struck one clearly silvery stroke, it fell. And a wild shriek rang through the room, a death shriek. I am not given to fainting, but I certainly confessed that the next 10 minutes of my existence was a cold blank, and even when I did manage to stagger to my feet, I gazed round, vainly endeavoring to understand the chilly horror which still possessed me. Thank God, the room was rid of that awful presence. I saw that, so, gulping down some wine, I lighted a wax taper and staggered towards the bed. Oh, how I prayed that after all I might have been dreaming, and that my own excited imagination had but conjured up some hideous memory of the dissecting room. But one glance was sufficient to answer that. No, the summons had indeed been given and answered. I flashed the light over the dead face, swollen, convulsed, still with the death agony, but suddenly I shrank back. Even as I gazed, the expression of the face seemed to change. The blackness faded into a deathly whiteness. The convulsed features relaxed, and even as if the victim of that dread apparition still lived, a sad, solemn smile stole over the pale lips. I was intensely horrified, but still I retained sufficient self-consciousness to be struck professionally by such a phenomenon. Surely there was something more than supernatural agency in all this. Again, I scrutinized the dead face, and even the throat and chest, but with the exception of a tiny pimple on one temple beneath a cluster of hair, not a mark appeared. To look at the corpse, one would have believed that this man had indeed died by the visitation of God, peacefully, while sleeping. How long I stood there, I know not, but time enough to gather my scattered senses and to reflect that, all things considered, my own position would be very unpleasant if I found myself thus unexpectedly in a room of the mysteriously dead man. So as noiselessly as I could, I made my way out of the house, No one met me on the private staircase. The little door opening into the road was easily unfastened, and thankfully indeed was I to feel again the fresh wintry air as I hurried along the road by the churchyard. There was a magnificent funeral soon in that church, and it was said that the young widow of the buried man was inconsolable. And then rumors got abroad of a horrible apparition which had been seen on the night of the death, and it was whispered the young widow was terrified and insisted upon leaving her splendid mansion. I was too mystified by the whole affair to risk my reputation by saying what I knew, and I should have allowed my share in it to remain forever buried in oblivion, had I not suddenly heard the widow objecting to many of the legacies in the last will of her husband, intended to dispute it on the score of insanity. And then there gradually arose the rumor of his belief in having received a mysterious summons. On this I went to the lawyer, and sent a message to the lady that, as the last person who had attended to her husband, I undertook to prove his sanity, and I besought her to grant me an interview in which I would relate as strange and horrible a story as ear had ever heard. The same evening I received an invitation to go to the mansion. I was ushered immediately into a splendid room, and there standing before the fire was the most dazzlingly beautiful creature I had ever seen. She was very small, but exquisitely made. Had it not been for the dignity of her carriage, I should have believed her a mere child. I come on a strange and painful errand, I began, and then I started, for I happened to glance full into her eyes, and from them down to the small right hand grasping the chair. The wedding ring was on that hand.
I conclude you are the Mr. Reed who requested permission to tell me some absurd ghost story, and whom my late husband mentions here.
As she spoke, she stretched out her left hand towards something, but what, I knew not, for my eyes were fixed on that hand. Horror! White and delicate it might be, but it was shaped like a claw, and the third finger was missing. One sentence was enough after that. Madam, all I can tell you is that the ghost who summoned your husband was marked by a singular deformity. The third finger of the left hand was missing, I said sternly, and the next instant I had left that beautiful, sinful presence. That will was never disputed. The next morning, too, I received a check for £1,000. And the next news I heard of the widow was that she had herself seen that awful apparition and had left the mansion immediately.
Want to give a big welcome to Miles Broadhead and thank him for narrating this episode. Thank you for coming, Miles.
Thank you so much for having me.
Miles, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit of your background for the listeners before we get into the after talk.
Well, I am a true Utah native. I was born here, but I've lived out of here enough that I feel like I can claim that I'm not. What about me? I love this kind of stuff. This podcast to me is so amazing because I was just talking about this morning with my brother and his wife that radio plays in most ways are so far superior to anything that you could see on stage if you have an imagination and are willing to indulge it. That's why I love these.
Well, thank you. I love them too. I think I actually got first interested in stuff like this with H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, and they had a radio show for that, and it blew me away. And so I'm so glad that you like this medium. Thank you for going on.
And it's interesting that you bring up that specifically, because that was the one radio play in history that everybody's imaginations got so out of control. Everybody was kind of creating just from words what was existing. And, you look back and, there was no riots and people weren't killing themselves and all that stuff. But that's even better, that it created all of these urban legends surrounding something that was so masterfully done.
Yes. Me and Mason Yates talked a little bit about that on The Hound, another episode on the podcast, and we talked about how there was all this widespread panic. Like everyone was tuning into the radio, especially because you listen to the original recording and they have an orchestra playing music and they play some jazz, and then we interrupt this program to bring you and it's like this whole report.
Right.
So no wonder it freaked people out.
Well, it would freak you out. I mean, especially back when information wasn't so on demand.
Right.
You could sort of live in a world of how you think the rest of the world is operating, because there was no way to instantly say, oh, well, actually the world's not living that way, or it is. You had to just sort of let your mind sort of determine how you viewed the world. And I think we do that even with all the information. But imagine back then when it was not so readily available.
Not at your fingertips, right? So Miles, reading through The Ghost's Summons by Ada Buisson, what was your favorite part of the story?
I think that this is a little bit of a gem, because when you first sent it to me, I read it one way, and in my mind it sounded one way, and I created this whole scenario within it. But then I picked it up and read it again, and it was a whole different story, a whole different feel, a whole different everything. And then I put it down, and then again the same thing happened personally. But then I come in to record it with you, and it sort of manifested. We were talking before we started, let's get it on its feet and see what it does.
Yeah.
And it totally is probably a hybrid version of all three of those ways. So if you own a piece of literature like this, you can recreate the story and it wouldn't be boring, because your mind can do whatever you want with it.
Yes. And I think that's one of the beauties of especially classic literature, because I mean, we lose a lot of context for stories back from, this is a Victorian ghost story. And we talked about this, but for any listeners out there, Victorian ghost stories come from, they weren't in print. They were actually more verbal storytelling devices just for families originally. And most Victorian ghost stories actually, during that age, were written by women. And a lot of ghost stories were written by women. That's kind of how they snuck into the industry and started making incomes for themselves and creating names and careers for themselves, is through writing. And Victorian ghost stories started with everyone, it's winter, so they all gather around the fire because it's warm there. And they wanted to provide entertainment. So they just started telling these ghost stories.
The only reason I get jealous of growing up in the time that I do versus perhaps in a time like this is because everybody was so into this. It wasn't you turned the channel because that wasn't pleasing to you. Right. It wasn't that you were seeking out. That was what was in front of you. So your mind had to be engaged to make it what you wanted out of that. Yeah. And again, it goes back to what I said previously. When entertainment was so simple, your brain actually filled in the blanks, and that can get even scarier than the words.
Actually, just because I'm also a small-time composer and I compose music for this podcast, something that is kind of a principle in music is it's kind of letting the brain fill in the blank.
Yeah.
So you have a low tone sound and a high tone sound, which is why you hear a lot of low drones and high violins or something in music, because that creates this distance, and supposedly that's what allows our brain to kind of fill it in, because low sounds is like a lion, right? It's a predator. But then this high sound is like it's something above us. So is the predator above us? It's confusing to the brain. So it starts to try and fill in that gap.
Right.
Just because you said something about that, and it reminded me of that. So do you think that there's a moral to this story? I'm struggling to find a moral to this story other than maybe something concerning the now widow, but the wife. But what do you think?
Well, I think that because you sent me this question before, so I had time to kind of sit and think about it. I think if there is to be a moral to be found, again, the beauty of writing like this is you can sort of dig it out yourself. I see a lot of something as basic as don't judge a book by its cover, or, really a peek into the understanding of things that you don't understand. So here comes this person into this other person's life. This person is dying. Now, we could take all of the aspect of supernatural and ghost and everything, and we could actually pull that a little bit back and think the doctor, even though he's around death all the time, now he has to solve the issue of humanity. And maybe the concept of humanity is actually supernatural to him.
Oh.
So his brain sort of filled in that blank. Here's this unexplainable man dying in front of me. He's asking me to do this. Why is he doing that? This is all so scary and supernatural and crazy. Now my brain is thinking that, and it's seeing different things for what they may or may not be, or I'm interpreting a situation to be how my brain wants to see it. Now, moral-wise, we have to look at each individual, especially people who are going through some really serious stuff that looks scary to us, that we want to repel away from, that we want to recoil from. But at the end of the day, death is really the most natural thing that happens in life.
Ooh, that's pretty profound. That's the only guarantee in life.
That is the only guarantee in life. So as scary as this is, and think about ghosts for a minute. Think about ghost stories.
Uh-huh.
Why are we scared of that?
That's a good question.
This is something that if that were true, it's not something to be afraid of. It's something that should give you hope in your world. Here's this person that existed who is no longer alive in the sense that we interpret that to be, but is now in front of us again, scaring us again, knocking things over, all of which are really not scary. None of that is scary. In fact, it should be exhilarating if you believe in that. So again, it goes back to our brains, interpreting information how we are the most comfortable digesting it in the moment.
Yeah. I also want to say the concept that we have of ghosts is warped because before, I think it was before the 1800s or the 1700s, it was right around when projection was becoming a big thing. So this was before moving pictures and everything. But you know how when people would take old photos, they'd have to stand very still for a long time after the photo, so that way it wouldn't mess up. Because if they moved, there would be this like imprint, this opaque imprint of them, and it would look weird. Well, back when projectionism was starting out, there was something called phantasmagoria, and it was everyone would gather into a dark room, they'd have a projection artist, and they would just put up scary images on the wall. So it's like, oh, here's a ghoul, here's a skeleton, and then people in the images were seen as opaque. And that is what caused people to say, oh, those are ghosts. Before that time, ghosts were considered as physical a being as you and me.
Right.
It was like ghosts can appear in front of you, they can touch you, they are real, and then you turn around and they're gone. That's what a ghost is. But then after this flaw in old time technology came about, people started saying, no, that's what ghosts are like. They're opaque. They're spirits. And that's still what we do today. You see like ghost hunter shows where they're using EKG machines and all this stuff. And it's like that comes from a misconception of old technology.
Or, it is sort of fun if you think about that. A lot of people need tangible something to hang on to. And I think we're getting too far into that. And I'm not here to preach about this, but I think it's so much more fun that we can't explain something, that we don't need an EKG machine, or we don't, allow the noises to happen around you. There's tons of things that are real that I can't explain.
Right.
And those are the things that scare me.
Yeah.
So it's glorious. It's a glorious story. And it can be read 100 different times, interpreted 100 different ways, and it could always be different. And I think that's fantastic.
So in this story, I'm struggling to really define what the shape and the apparition was, because by the end of the story, we see that the wife has her same finger missing. So I think the logical explanation would be to say that she killed her husband. And maybe it was the pimple on the temple or something. Maybe she poisoned him. Don't really know. But I think the logical explanation is to say that she killed her husband. But why did he see a shape, right? And at a certain point, he says that he put sleeping powder in the wine, and then it says after that he drank a glass of wine. So do you think that he just forgot that he put sleeping powder in there and he drank some wine and was also under this influence where the wife could have been seen as this apparition, or was it something actually supernatural?
This is where I want to go.
Uh-huh.
As much as the logic that you just used, definitely that happens. But I want to go a little bit differently than there. I love the supernatural aspect, but let me propose this. There is a dying man that does not want to die alone. Perhaps his relationship with his wife has caused him grief. Perhaps he knows, he has some information that we don't, that when death comes knocking, perhaps that form is a manifestation of fears, anxieties, things that caused him things, blah, blah, blah. It has come to collect him in a way. His wife's hand was more a part of the patchwork of these things that are coming to take him. Maybe that was a beautiful sign. Maybe it was he wanted to walk into death with his wife's hand, and his wife's hand reached out to take him.
Oh, that's touching.
And yeah, I mean, you see, these are all the things that when we don't understand and when we start only looking in one or two directions, we forget to see. Yeah. Maybe that was the most beautiful moment that this doctor got paid to experience with this other soul.
Wow, that's really interesting. I had similar, I don't know, I would say a conflict of belief with the oval portrait because, like whether the wife stayed, because the story of that is that a painter's painting his wife and she stays there so long because he paints for so long that she dies. And I had a conflict on whether I should believe that she loved him so much that she just stayed there and let him paint her until she died, or if she was spiteful and jealous of his love for his art over her, so she just stayed there until she died to kind of show him.
That is such, though, the best analogy for how people run through this life. You can create beauty within yourself, but if you keep overdoing it and trying to add too much and changing it and looking at, and you can't just appreciate the beauty of the imperfection, then pretty soon what we were trying to create and capture and make beautiful, whatever, has withered or lost interest or walked away. Yeah. You know, the fun thing I think about being a human being is the capability to look at things from 100 different directions and agree with them all or disagree with them all. But where I see this story, where the manifestation of the spirit, the shape, the whatever, that is truly what I feel to be that man. And you know, the other thing is, take this. Maybe the wife was never alive. Maybe she was dead before.
What?
Maybe he saw her as a ghost, or maybe that was the shared, because she came to obviously shepherd him. He was called back to a situation and then she vanished. Like you just said, ghosts used to be something that could touch you, something that could tap on your shoulder and say goodbye.
And so that's why she immediately left the mansion, is because she was actually a spirit and she left too. God, that's cool.
It is cool.
Cool to think about.
I mean, you can do it whatever you want with it, but there's so much that you could do. Yeah. At the end of the day, what we absolutely know is we don't know.
Well, and the reason that I was like, well, maybe it was the wife who murdered the husband and all of that is because this story reminded me of Lizzie Borden. Do you know anything about Lizzie?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So, listeners, Lizzie Borden was this woman who went to trial for the murder of, I think it was her parents, right? Yeah. So basically the whole story is that her parents were found murdered with an axe in their own home, mother up in a bedroom, and then father...
This is going to be an episode.
Yeah. And then father down in like the living room. And basically her sister walks in and is like, oh, my parents are dead. And Lizzie is just laughing and like kind of joyous. And it's like, okay, well, what's going on? And the police come, they do an investigation. It's like Lizzie is there at the time. She was there with the people. She had access to the weapon. In fact, she had like very haphazardly buried the thing.
What does that remind you of? Something that you and I just went through together. The end of Sweeney Todd.
Oh, yeah.
Toby had nothing to do with the murders, but he was so driven to this moment of insanity that he's laughing, and who knows? I mean, again, a lot of life is just the interpretation of those who don't really have the wherewithal to see something different within the situation.
Yeah, yeah. So the thing with Lizzie Borden is that basically all of the evidence said that she did it, but the court ruled that she didn't for one reason or another. And in fact, the theory after that ruling was just that a crazed madman walked into the house, killed 2 people, and walked out. And
I mean, and at the time, that was not off base.
Oh, of course.
I mean, it's not off base now. Have you been to Florida?
Right.
Sorry if you're from Florida, but not sorry. Okay, kind of sorry.
But that's just what I was thinking. Like, if the wife murdered the husband, it reminded me of Lizzie Borden. But I don't know.
But the one thing to kind of keep in mind, why? I mean, this is a ghost story. You know, we've been armed with this information so I can see why the brain would immediately turn to such striking negativity in the situation.
Right.
A murder. There's obviously something crazy. There's obviously something whatever. But we don't know. So again, the brilliance of this writing is we can interpret that in so many different ways. We could read this again as a love story, and it would sound completely different.
But we're not told anything about their relationship. Right. I mean, so the guy hires a doctor to come and see him in his last moments, and we don't know where the wife is. Like, no one's at the mansion, actually. Like, no one is there, which is interesting. Not a servant, not his wife, not any of his friends. And it's if you knew you were going to die, you'd think you'd want, like, you'd tell all of your family members, your friends, your close and loved ones that I want you to be there at my deathbed. But he went to a doctor. So does that mean that he had an alienated relationship with his family or with his wife? Or was it out of panic?
Or he loved them so much that he knew he was dying. And he wanted them to live their own life. He hired a doctor because that was the most practical professional that should attend.
You're taking all of these sympathetic routes, and I'm taking all the bad ones. Well, yeah, that is true. It's just we're given so little about their relationship other than the wife seemed to be inconsolable after learning of her husband's death.
Well, I don't know if you take comments, but maybe your listeners can comment on what they think, because
I would love to take comment. Honestly, I need people to email the podcast, comment, whatever, because yes, please. I need more audience interaction.
Yeah, we honestly, these are the types of conversation that start these great change of I want to see into those brains and say, okay, now you're literally the consuming audience. What do you think? What now that we've kind of counterpointed across from each other, what's your take on it out there?
Please let us know.
Very curious.
Yeah. And this also, for anyone who doesn't know, this podcast is on YouTube now, so you can look up the Poe Show. We are on YouTube. You can send comments there. I think you can do something like it through Spotify. I don't know about Apple Podcasts, but wherever you can, email the show and go to YouTube, give us your comments, because I would love to interact with you guys.
And Tynan, thank you for having me. If you're interested, I am a voice and stage actor, singer here in Utah. You can follow me on Instagram at Miles Broadhead.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you to give us your socials.
I still do have Facebook because I am in my 40s.
I have Facebook too.
Okay, well then I don't feel so bad. But yeah, I love these interactions, and this honestly has been amazing. Thank you so much for letting me do this, and then having this amazing conversation.
Of course, thank you for coming on, and thank you for having this conversation. Last question, and then I'll let you go. Plenty of people think that classic horror just isn't scary nowadays. And I think we've had different kinds of horror through the decades. Like we had 70s and 80s slasher films. We had, 90s action movies.
Yeah.
So, and now I think we're into more of that ambient kind of psychological horror. But do you think that this story could still be considered scary nowadays? And if so, why? If not, why not? And is there anything that we could have added to it or changed about it to make it more scary?
Okay, so I think that I think the writing is perfect, and you've heard my reasoning for that.
Yeah.
Is it scary? Well, that really depends on you, doesn't it? Because the beauty of this is you can make it as scary or as not scary as you want, because we're not showing you gore effects. We're not blood packs splattering. We're not CGIing something terrifying in front of you. We're giving you what we can give you with our voices, and your mind can do the work from there. Comparatively, I think these types of stories, or any type of story like this, is scarier because it gives just a little peek into how my brain or what my brain considers scary. And sometimes that scares me. If you thought it was scary, great. I mean, honestly, there really is something both beautiful and terrifying about this story. And that's up to you to do the work in your head. It's really easy. We did this as children. We imagined these scenarios, these impossible scenarios happening all around us, but we made them real when we were kids. As adults, we get lazy with our brains, and we don't let them work. We let the CGI or the this or the that or the whatever. That does the work. And, I'm sure you're going to put some Foley into this with some, music or whatever.
Yeah, create some ambiance.
And that helps. That's like salt and pepper. Yeah. The feast is there, folks. I mean, this is terrifying. We're just allowing you to explore with your imagination what makes it scary to you.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Miles, for coming on to the Poe Show. Thank you for this great conversation, and you did such a great job with the story. So thank you for coming on. Again, where can people reach you?
So Instagram at Miles Broadhead. That's the easiest way to know kind of what's up in my career. We got a lot of cool things for me coming up. I'd love to see faces in audiences. That's cool too. But definitely subscribe to this podcast. It's awesome. Comment on it. This is something that is dying in this world, and we need to keep it alive. So help us do it.
Thank you, Miles. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Poe Show. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Miles Broadhead. He's been amazing to work with, both on stage and here in the studio. And again, you can find him on Instagram at Miles Broadhead. That's MilesBroadhead. If you enjoyed this episode, then subscribe to the podcast, like the episode, share it with everyone that you know. We have a new episode the 25th of every month, and I'm hoping to start uploading every 2 weeks soon, but I gotta finish up a stage show that I'm doing right now first. You can follow this podcast on Instagram or on Threads at the Poe Show Podcast, where I post teasers at new episodes, highlights of previous episodes, and on Threads, I'm starting a Poe Out of Context series. If you want to learn more, follow on Threads. You can also join the Poe Show Patreon for exclusive access to behind the scenes, explaining how episodes are broken down, how I compose the music, updates on new material that I plan to feature on the podcast, and much more. If you have any questions about this episode or any suggestions for future episodes, please email poeshowpod@gmail.com. That's POESHOWPOD@gmail.com, and I'll address those in a future episode and feature suggested stories on the podcast. Thanks again for listening, and you'll hear from me again on the next episode of The Poe Show.